Okay, great. All right, well, welcome. Hi, my name is Deepika Nagabhushan. I'm a senior policy researcher at Project 2030. And on behalf of Project 2030, Climate Center, and California Environmental Voters, I welcome you all, and thanks for taking the time today to discuss carbon dioxide removal. I'm just gonna quickly share my screen here. Okay, I think we'll move on to our slideshow. Okay. For those of you who may have already attended a few of our webinars before, you will know that this webinar is a part of a 6-part series aiming to cover several topics on carbon dioxide removal. Our first webinar covered the science of carbon removal. In our second, we heard from experts about a wide range of CDR approaches. And our third covered safety and public health concerns and impacts regarding several CDR approaches. Our fourth discussed governance approaches and models for community engagement and empowerment. Today is our fifth, and today we will touch on how we can create accountability for CDR, or carbon dioxide removal. I'm just going to say CDR, it's short, through responsible measurement, reporting, and verification, or MRV in short. This MRV is a key concept in CDR because it pertains to how CDR will be implemented, who will buy, who will sell, and what will, how it will, and it will determine how much we trust this process, and as a result, how much we rely on it for climate change. Today, we have 3 leading experts on the topic to present and to answer our questions. I have a few context-setting slides for you before we invite our speakers over. One last thing, please mark your calendars. March 28th will be our final webinar, the 6th one in the series, and we will cover the topic of policy levers with a specific focus on California opportunities. You'll receive an email, so please keep an eye out for it, and we hope to see you there. In all of our webinars, we like to begin with just noting a few things about CDR. So we'll do the same today. Our first point is that carbon removal is different from carbon capture. It's a different climate solution. There may be in some cases that there's shared infrastructure or some chemistry would look similar, but they are 2 different things. Carbon capture takes CO2 out of the smokestacks of existing facilities and stops it from reaching the atmosphere. Carbon removal takes CO2 out of the atmosphere, directly from the atmosphere. Second, to meet our global climate goals of staying below 1.5 Celsius of warming, we not only need to stop emitting all of the CO2, we also need to start removing the CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. We need to remove billions of it every single year, continuously for several decades by mid-century. So we need to both turn off the faucet as well as widen the drain to empty out this proverbial CO2 bathtub by mid-century. CDR is that drain. We'll need a bouquet of several CDR approaches to do this. They will work together to address this legacy CO2 emission that we've put in the atmosphere over 250 years of industrial activity. We acknowledge that several audience members today and several organizations working on climate may not always agree on how we will do CDR, how we must do CDR, but the 3 host organizations here want to disclose these shared principles that we have. First, we need CDR. 2, we also need to completely cut emissions and phase out fossil fuels. And carbon removals are not a substitute for reducing emissions. And CDR projects, when they get implemented, should be community-centered and designed with input from communities. They should not worsen air, the environment, or the public health from their activities. And nature-based CDR is critical and also has co-benefits that reach far beyond the climate. In California, carbon removal is expected to play a significant role in our strategy to meet carbon neutrality goals, which were adopted under AB 1279 in 2022. Under this, CDR is expected to remove about 15% of our emissions. The scoping plan released the same year by the California Air Resources Board sets out a target of 7 million metric tons on an annual basis by 2030 and 75 million metric tons on an annual basis by 2045. And today there is hardly any CDR in California. There are two worlds in which CDR exists today. One is known as the voluntary carbon market, and that's called VCM. And across the world, CDR is primarily being driven by VCM. It's a market that's created by private volunteers who are willing to pay for CDR. So much of the measurement, reporting, and verification apparatus comes from the work that these private entities have done. And so some of the terminology also comes from this world. We will learn a lot more about this from our speakers, but we think it'll be great to kick off with a little activity. We always have an interactive activity at the beginning of our webinars, and today we have a little terminology quiz. In a second, you will see a box pop up on your screen. On the left, you see a list of 4 terms, often used in the VCM world. And on the right, the drop-downs give you options of definitions that match some of these words. So go ahead, please take a moment to look at those drop-downs and match the definition with the term on the left. And at the end, I'll show the answers. How are we doing?
We're doing well. We got 45 people responding. I think folks are slowly answering. We'll give folks just another like 15 seconds to go. All right, as the polls slow down, we'll go ahead and bring the poll to a close and share the results.
Okay. Looks like several of us got them right. Just for anybody who wants to cross-check their answers, here are the right definitions. And if you got them right, that's amazing. Okay. I'm going to keep this on for just another second and move to the next slide. Okay. Quick housekeeping before we jump into our presentations. Please add your questions to the question and answer box here on Zoom. Remember that you may not see other questions from other attendees in the box until they are answered in text back in the box. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible live, verbally. We have 3 presentations today. We have a 5-minute segment that we've kept to invite comments from other panelists, and also, if possible, we can take audience questions. But we have a dedicated audience Q&A at the end of the 3 presentations, and we've allocated 30 minutes for it today. And with that, I would like to invite Danny, our first speaker, Danny Cullen-Ward, to please turn on his camera. And I will stop sharing my screen. Hi, Danny.
Hello, Deepika. How you doing?
I'd like to say a few words to introduce you. Danny was just on a Climate Center webinar last week, so likely no stranger to several of you in the audience. Danny is an economist and a lawyer, and he has written a book called Making Climate Policy Work, along with David Victor, that identifies limitations of market-based policies in meeting climate goals. He's on the board of California's Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee and is also a board member at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which develops standards and guidance for carbon inventories. So Danny, welcome. Thanks for being here. Over to you.
Thank you, Deepika, and thank you everybody for having me. I appreciate the chance to join you, especially since you were so kind to ask me to speak on the Cap and Trade program last week. So I'm going to give a couple of different perspectives in some opening remarks. I'm going to try and give 3 different points of view about this carbon removal and measurement reporting and verification question. The first is I really want to center us with some context about the state of the world, which is not always fun to look at, but I think we need to look at really carefully. The second, I want to talk about what I think is the major risk facing this industry right now from a long-term perspective. And from my perspective, that risk is that it shows many signs of replicating the failures and potential eventual corruption of the conventional offsets industry. And I think it's really important to look at what went wrong with the conventional offsets industry and to ask whether or not we're headed down that path. And the third thing I'll say is some remarks on how we can hopefully try and avoid some of those outcomes. I'm going to offer some constructive criticism here. At times, I'm going to be pretty sharp about where I see the carbon removal industry, but I want to carefully ground this in the perspective of somebody who has been a longtime advocate for a balanced approach to carbon removal. And so I think the values Deepika and colleagues shared at the beginning of this event resonate with me. And I think there's an important role to play for carbon removal as we manage the climate transition. But I think if we can just level set for a second, I think it's really important to observe the world is not on track for a 2-degree warming limit. We're blowing past 1.5. That's out of the question. And I don't think there's much of a case that we're going to get on track for 2 degrees right now. I'm hopeful we can turn that around. But I think we're looking at potentially substantially higher warming. And I think there's a couple of implications that follow from the fact that most countries are not on track to achieve their national climate pledges, and those pledges collectively, even if they were implemented, don't put us on track for 2 degrees. There's 2 implications that I want to draw. One is that we're looking at higher warming and or overshoot scenarios, which has a number of implications for the role of carbon removal. It also implies a longer time frame to climate stabilization. And I think this is often lost in conversations about the role of non-permanent carbon removal and carbon storage. When you are not on track for 2 degrees or 1.5 C, you're looking at temperature stabilization happening not this century, but next, and possibly quite a bit longer, depending on the path we ultimately take. From a political perspective, I think it's also important to observe that the US is sliding into autocracy. We are losing massive progress at the US level, and the geopolitical instability as malign foreign actors take command of key elements of US foreign soft and hard power are going to have significant implications for the energy transition and the rise of clean energy industries. Meanwhile, in those parts of places like the United States that remain committed to climate policy action, places like California, we see pretty lean budget environments, and we also see pretty significant affordability concerns. And so those are going to constrict the range of opportunities that are available. I think there's a really important perspective one can take on this, which is given that we're off track and things don't look good, it's very easy to say, don't do carbon removal. This is a waste of time. Um, I think it's important to acknowledge that carbon removal is less important at times when we are absolutely struggling to make progress on conventional mitigation, but it remains an important part of the overall system for balancing emissions and for addressing legacy emissions. So again, I come to you not to say don't do this, but to recognize that the very difficult position we are in, I think, is unfortunately going to increase pressure to cut corners and make mistakes that will hobble the future of this sector and this industry if these risks are not taken seriously. So let me start with where I think the major risk in this industry is right now with respect to MRV, to the measurement, reporting, verification, the standardization of the industry, which is a critical part of its growth from the very early stages it's in and has been in for the last couple of years to a future where you can imagine complying with the kinds of targets California has set, let alone the gigaton scale removal that's likely required for temperature stabilization. And the unfortunate reality is the easiest way to raise money in any sort of climate industry, and in fact, the primary business model that almost every venture capitalist who invested in carbon removal bet on, is the idea of selling carbon credits as offsets to largely voluntary buyers with the hope that in the future, government buyers would take that role. I know we'll hear from Anu and others who've been thinking very helpfully about how to think about, the public good nature of carbon removal and long-term roles for public procurement. And there's a lot of exciting ideas to talk through. But in the near term, people are selling offsets, and they are developing this industry around the creation of carbon credits that look almost identical methodologically and institutionally to the way that concept is done in the conventional segments of the industry, where, to make a very long story short, nothing is working. Every major academic study that comes out about the state of the voluntary carbon market not only finds that the vast majority of credits don't represent real climate benefits, but I think more importantly, when you look under the hood, and how standards are written and how methodologies are developed and the role of verification and auditing in this process, it is largely a performative theater to distract from the fact that self-interested, financially interested market participants write their own rules. And that's a challenge for the carbon removal industry because there's enormous pressure from the investors in this community to see growth in revenue and to see exit and to see deployment. And deployment is good. I'm entirely in favor of progress and moving things forward. But carbon removal not only has to address, confront, and improve on the conventional approaches taken in the carbon crediting industry, but it also faces a number of new challenges that are distinct and specific and frankly harder in the context of carbon removal. One example of a problem is mitigation deterrence, and this has come up a lot in carbon offsets, where the notion of a carbon offset allows an incumbent polluter to basically keep polluting and pay somebody else to cut emissions. You cannot stabilize the temperature by paying somebody else not to emit. Similarly, you cannot stabilize the temperature by saying it's okay, I put CO2 up because I'm paying somebody else to take it out. Only under very limited and narrow circumstances could that claim ever be defensible from a physical perspective. And increasingly, lots of new research is coming out showing that we have fundamental growth limitations in how much of this removal we can do. And we can't offer everybody the opportunity, in theory even, to say, I'll offset my emissions with carbon removal. There's just not enough land, there's not enough energy, there's not enough water, there's not enough food. You can't do it at these scales unless we massively shrink emissions first. And we risk, with a lot of the business models that are being set up in the public and the private sectors, increasing those tensions and exacerbating those trade-offs. I'll give you a couple of examples of MRV issues that are specific. For example, if you want to talk about additionality, which is a common requirement in these programs, to have a climate benefit that is new and caused by the funding that comes into the project when you sell carbon credits. This is important. This is fundamental to the claim that a carbon credit can be used to offset or mitigate the impacts of another person's pollution. It's really easy to say in carbon removal, I'm doing something new and I'm doing something different. So very clearly there's an intervention in this project that's new. Whereas in time after time in the conventional offsets industry, we find examples of people paying for things that were already happening. And if somebody builds a direct air capture facility or a biomass energy plant with carbon capture and storage, it's really easy to see something new. But I think we often lose sight of the environmental impacts of these interventions. It's actually quite difficult to quantify the climate impact of these projects, particularly in the near term. For example, if you were to take a direct air capture facility, which is new and no one's ever built one before in a certain location, you go and you build it and you sell carbon credits. Well, what's the overall emissions impact of that facility? You can very easily measure the CO2 it captures and filters from the ambient air, but unless you are extremely rigorous about how you quantify the energy impacts of that very energy intensive facility's consumption of electricity and heat energy, you can end up very quickly creating false emissions claims. And frankly, to do the clean energy procurement in a way that doesn't increase emissions on the rest of the electricity grid would massively increase the cost of that project and therefore the price of any carbon credits that would need to be sold from it to maintain high integrity outcomes. Another example, and this is an example where I think the specific nature of the carbon removal intervention makes NRB really hard. Consider enhanced rock weathering. I'm sure my colleagues will speak more about this. This is a very promising area of carbon removal where, to be perfectly honest, we don't really know how to measure. There are competing theories about how to do that. And in some respects, there may be kind of a race to the bottom happening, as the cheaper and less high quality interventions offer lower price carbon credits and set up an industrial political economy dynamic that favors less certain and lower quality outcomes to outcompete those who say, I want to hold the line, maybe lose some money in the process, but maintain a higher standard of crediting and a higher standard for integrity. These are really tough issues for a nascent industry, one that has in some of its applications genuine scientific uncertainty where we need to deploy and learn what works. But we have throughout it, as we saw in the conventional offsets industry, perverse incentives to cut corners to lower credit prices and boost supplies. And that is fundamentally the financial interest that investors and private companies have in this space. And the idea that delegating the instrumentation and the standards development process to the private sector under those conditions, which we know for a fact didn't work with 30 years of conventional offsets, seems pretty clearly headed for the same outcome if we don't change course and change course soon. So it seems to me one of the ways we can avoid these problems is if we, first of all, start talking about them. Second, I think there's a kind of a modest but important shift to basically say, let's not do offsetting anymore, and to talk about what in scholarly circles people are calling the contribution model, where buyers, whether private or public, can advertise the fact of their financial support, can advertise the expected climate benefits from a project, but don't make any claim to offset, mitigate, or compensate for any of their own emissions. Because right now, we frankly don't know what works. And what we have is an innovation and a deployment problem. And instead of making exaggerated or potentially false claims about the impact of these interventions today, why don't we speak about them truthfully and honestly and say, we know we need to start. And people who start doing this are doing the world a great service and should be proud and should celebrate that. But we shouldn't over-index on the kinds of claims we are ready to make today. And in fact, we should maybe acknowledge that we don't know everything we need to know to make responsible claims today. I want to acknowledge that in suggesting the shift in the way we talk about and finance these kinds of projects, it's going to require people with very different goals to speak up and put money on the table. And that's particularly difficult in an environment where, for example, public budgets are thin, as is the case at the state and federal level in the US with respect to climate policy. Nevertheless, I don't think that the path we're on is going to lead us to an outcome where there's going to be much consensus or support. And I deeply worry that we are recreating many of the well-documented pressures of large-scale efforts to create positive outcomes in sectors where we need more resources and support, like natural and working lands, like international climate financial assistance. Worthy goals have been pursued for decades in a model that has a very clear political endpoint, which is the weakening of standards set by private financially conflicted interests who are unresponsive to scientific evidence and public pressure to improve outcomes. And that is not a storyline in which carbon removal makes the contributions that Deepika so thoughtfully outlined as important to the future of climate policy. So that is my very bleak, but I hope helpful and constructive intervention to say, as somebody who's been working on these issues for decades, I am panicked. I have been promoting carbon removal. I continue to promote carbon removal in a responsible way. And I am very worried that the industry is headed down a path we will all regret in the years ahead. If we don't start talking soon about how to get real and how to get responsible about the difficult and important measurement consequences and what will happen if we start cutting corners soon, which worries me, to be perfectly honest. And I look forward to the conversation with the rest of the panelists and to discussion with the audience later in the program. Thank you. Deepika, you're muted, sorry.
Deepika, you're still muted.
Wow, sorry, thank you. Thank you so very much, Danny, for that amazing perspective that is, very often not heard when, everyone is we're in the race to, build more projects and, count the tons really as quickly as we can. So very important perspective. I would like to invite at this time Anu and Eli, our other two panelists, to join us on camera if they would like to provide some comment just in response to everything Danny just outlined, or if they have any questions. I'd like to give them the first right of refusal in this little Q&A segment.
I'm happy to jump in if that's okay. I have a lot of questions and thoughts, and I feel like I just need to schedule additional time to dig in. I think one thing that is always top of mind for me is how do we learn from the conventional offset market? I also have a sense that we're doing a lot of the same things over again. This weird like Groundhog Day thing in conversations. I'm curious, Danny, since you've been in this space for a long time, is there a mistake that is really top of mind for you? They're like, oh man, we really should not do this specific mechanism again.
It's hard to give you a specific answer. I think it's the idea that the people selling the product should write their own rules. I think that's the mistake. I was on a planning call yesterday with a group of researchers and funders thinking about how to survey these markets around the world. And there was a nerdy debate in the chat in the meeting about, we have a question that asks so many different parts. Could we maybe drop the part that asks, how do carbon crediting systems respond to findings that there are junk credits in their program? And I put in chat somewhat snarkily, you don't need to ask that question because the answer is nobody ever does anything about it ever in any circumstance. And one of the senior most funders at a very high profile, very newsworthy funder put a little laughing emoji because it's the open secret in the whole industry. And I think I'm heartened, Anu, by the work you and others are doing to try and say, how do we do this right? And how do we bring this not just in the private sector? And I'm not saying private sector bad today. I'm saying in any industry, if you put that industry in charge of regulating itself, particularly when the commodity is a fictitious counterfactual claim, you're not going to get a good result. And I think we have let our enthusiasm for innovation and deployment, where I am 100% in those camps as to the progress we can make and the possibilities for doing better. We have turned a blind eye toward the governance and the financial incentives, as in any other industry would be significant, particularly in one like ours, where the product is a counterfactual claim. It's not something you can hold up and look at with your eyes and say, see, here's the outcome. You can see the direct air capture plant. The climate intervention is a series of complex, technically intermediated counterfactual claims that need to have integrity. And right now we are deferring to the supply side of the market to set those rules.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to make Danny's point, sort of in the language that I often think about this with, and specific to MRV, in other industries, the standards development organizations are often these nonprofits that are containers for the constructive tension between firms that all want the market to grow but have their own perspectives. And at the end of the day, the buyer has some physical feedback about the product. And so you can have this constructive tension of financial incentives and still arrive at an industry standard. I think to Danny's point, we don't have that in carbon removal. We need a different way of thinking about what is this product and what is the feedback. And it will likely need to look different than other large scale commodity industries because of that lack of physical feedback of the product. Sorry, I did the thing where I turned a question into a comment. I apologize.
Yeah. Thank you, Anu. Thank you. It's probably a great segue because you're next. Why don't I introduce you and we can continue to have your comments segue into your presentation. So I'd like you to turn back on your camera. Anu Khan is an electrochemist by training, but spent several years identifying a key gap in the carbon market. So last year, Anu founded Carbon Removal Standards Initiative, or CERSI, which is a nonprofit organization working to define regulatory standards for carbon removal. So Anu, over to you.
Luckily, I found a way to mess up my slides a little bit, but I'm going to share my slides really quickly and you all can let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
Does that look okay to you all? Okay, fantastic. So my name is Anu, and I recently launched a new nonprofit project called the Carbon Removal Standards Initiative. And first and foremost, I want to thank Deepika and all of the organizers for convening this conversation. For those of you I've met before, I am obsessed with MRV, so really excited to be here. And before I dive into some comments about the state of MRV today, I wanted to just share a little bit about what Cersei, pronounced like the Game of Thrones character, does in the CDR ecosystem as context setting for our conversation. So really quickly, our work is based on three basic principles. First, carbon removal is a public good. We can get into the details of, in the Ostrom typology, if this is actually a public good, but the fundamental idea here is that everybody benefits from carbon being removed from the atmosphere, from less severe warming, from lower carbon pollution overall. So first and foremost, carbon removal is a public good. As a public good, we believe that supply and demand will be largely driven by policy. As with other pollution cleanup efforts, folks don't do it unless the government tells them to do it. And ideally, government can also provide frameworks and tools for doing it well. Third, carbon removal as a climate solution will be embedded across regulated industries. So we often talk about carbon removal like a product, it's credits, it's a market, but at its most fundamental level, carbon removal is a physical process that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and those processes exist within many large-scale industries and across jurisdictions and across the globe today. And when we take these three factors together, where I land is there will be policymakers and regulators who have deep expertise in a range of topics who will become responsible for writing the rules for carbon removal and might not be very deep in the technical weeds of what exactly is happening in this industry in this moment in time. And so that is where our work at the Carbon Removal Standards Initiative comes in. We are a nonprofit project that provides technical assistance and capacity building for CDR policy focused on quantification. So really focused on working with policymakers and policy NGOs to understand for a given policy mechanism, idea, demand driver, are we confident that we are counting the carbon correctly? And our hope is that through this work, we'll be able to help build an industry that is transparent, accountable, and worthy of public investment. I also want to say, often when we talk about MRV, we get really quickly into quite wonky conversations about market integrity and a whole bunch of things that are really about the finances of CDR and MRV. And I just want to step back and note from our perspective and why I do this work, my team does this work, carbon removal is fundamentally a tool for climate justice. It's a tool for reparative justice. It's the only way that we get the carbon back out of the atmosphere that is causing so much harm through climate change and warming. And justice requires accountability. And justice in carbon removal requires the ability to count the carbon well. You need many other things in order to build a just and equitable carbon removal sector, but you absolutely need accountability and the ability to count the carbon well. So just to provide a little bit more clarity on where we sit within the broader CDR ecosystem as a nonprofit, you can imagine CDR loosely as supply, companies and different folks who are providing carbon removal as a service, and demand, folks, companies or governments that want that carbon removal activity, and they're connected by MRV. So it's this process of checking if we did what we said we were going to do. MRV itself can be divided into a number of different activities. Certainly not an all-inclusive list, but generally I think of MRV as standards, so the rules that you're going to use, tools, how you actually measure or quantify against your standard, data management, so the data you get from using your measurement tools, and then enforcement. So you go and look at your data, see if it met your standard and what you were trying to do, and then there is some consequence of that activity. All of these things are linked. You can't write standards without understanding the tools and models you're using. You can't collect data without those as well. But in general, we focus on this top line standards piece. It's sort of, can we agree on what we are actually measuring when we're doing carbon removal? And in practice, this means we do basically four things. We do knowledge management. So we're interested in understanding where there are actually gaps in how we do standards. Where there are gaps, we'll draft technical guidance to get the standardization process going. We'll also participate in standards development processes that are already underway. So some folks might be familiar with the NIST CDR consortium. So there's already processes and standards bodies and systems that exist for this. So we want to participate in those. And then lastly, carbon removal is a very new field. And as Danny mentioned, there are just gaps in our scientific understanding of these processes. And so we will also help catalyze research to develop the evidence base to actually get to a place where in the future we can have real industry-wide standards. But I think the key takeaway I would offer from this whole set of activities, which can be quite broad, is we're interested in building standardization from the bottom up. So for each little unit of carbon that we're measuring from one place to another, we want consistency and clarity on all of those little pieces to roll up into higher level standardization. And this is really different from how we often talk about standardization in carbon removal and carbon markets, is we need a top-down, really clear definition, and then all the good things will flow from that. Our theory of change is really about building from the bottom up. In the interest of time, I'm going to just super quickly share a little bit about the specific projects we work on. And specifically, I want to point folks to our policy landscape tool. So this is something that we built to help us understand what is happening in CDR, but also who is responsible for the quantification for this policy mechanism. How would that work? How would we know if the carbon removal policy was actually doing what we said it would do? And so if you are also curious about what's kind of in the conversation in terms of CDR policy today across jurisdictions, subnational, national, supranational, across CDR pathways, take a look at our policy landscape. And I think Mark is going to drop that link in the chat for everyone. But all of this to say, we work across jurisdictions and we work across durable CDR pathways. So that's basically most things except for living biomass, like living forests. That is not because durable CDR is more or less important than any other carbon removal pathway. It's just that some of the science is newer and there's more uncertainty and a lot of work that needs to be done in supporting standardization of some of these more novel durable CDR pathways. Okay, so I want to pull on a thread that I think Danny initially raised and I think could be a really interesting theme to discuss further in this conversation. Most of the activity today is in the voluntary carbon market. That's incredible. The innovation that is happening right now that's supported by really a relatively small number of buyers is incredible. And we need it to support early innovation and learning by doing. That said, I think most folks understand that the voluntary carbon market does not get very big. And ideally, we would start moving towards demand drivers that are more compliance-based. And so that's compliance carbon markets. That also is limited in how big it can plausibly get based on the analyses that have been done so far. And the scale of carbon removal integration in even compliance markets is much smaller than the numbers that are coming out of things like integrated assessment models and IPCC assessment reports. And so the question that I have is, how do we solve for this increasingly, almost fantastically large quantity of durable CDR? And what kind of quantification do we need from a policy perspective to know that we are actually solving for this very, very large problem? And what I would offer as a jumping off point for thinking about this is that the MRV and quantification and standardization we need is going to depend on the policy use case. So depending on what we're using the CDR for, if we're thinking about resource management or something that's more in the compensation claim area around residuals, or if we're thinking about corporate claims or national claims, it matters what the CDR is for and how we go about trying to measure it and what systems we want to fit into. And to give a little bit more specificity around this, there was a recent WRI paper on MRV that I think laid things out in a really interesting way, where you can think of the type of MRV as sort of jurisdictional, supranational, and national. You can think of it as specific to a policy. You can think about it for organizations or even for projects. And the specifics of what you do could vary based on this use case for your MRV. And I realize I'm probably at or over time. And so I just want to leave you all with 4 thoughts. First, carbon removal can be integrated into different policy and sectoral frameworks. Second, we need these diverse policy mechanisms in order to achieve scale. Third, there are a number of CDR pathways that are currently being explored that can be really interesting opportunities for testing this idea of integration and alternative policy mechanisms. Happy to talk more about that if it's interesting. And the MRV and quality infrastructure that we need will change based on the policy use case. So we don't want to only build MRV for today's voluntary carbon market. We want to build quality infrastructure for the gigaton scale CDR industry of 2100. And with that, I will stop sharing and answer any questions.
Thank you so very much, Anu. That was really interesting. I think that, after the perspective we heard from Danny, your points around, okay, we'll need to do this at some point, and there's got to be a starting point is really interesting. Can you answer a clarifying question for us as a group here? You referred to the voluntary carbon market, you referred to buyers and sellers. Could you clarify for our audience who are these buyers and what are they doing with these carbon removals that they buy and why are they buying them? What's their motivation today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the other speakers would also be great to chime in on this question, but in general, in the voluntary carbon market, buyers are purchasing towards their sustainability goals. There are a number of overarching net zero standards that folks are usually looking at. For some companies, that would be something like SBTI or Science-Based Targets Initiative. But generally, I think companies with a net zero sustainability goal are purchasing carbon credits of various types, including a limited but increasing amount of carbon removal towards their net zero goals.
Thank you. At this point, I was wondering if Eli or Danny might have any comments or questions for Anu before I try to take an audience question.
Eli, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, I know we've worked on this in the past, but I was wondering if you could explain the ERW example that you brought up on your last slide and how that can be a test case for alternative forms of MRV.
Yeah. Stop me if I get too in the weeds. So this one I think is really interesting, and I know quite a few folks across the CDR ecosystem are also pulling on this thread and trying to explore if this is a real opportunity. The way that I think about this is CDR as a resource management opportunity where the benefit is primarily around agricultural productivity and resource management with a CDR co-benefit. In our work, we're asking the question, could you use silicate rocks as a soil pH management technique for the purposes of soil pH management through existing policy drivers for improved agricultural productivity and soil health, for example, in the US, the EQIP program. And if you paid folks, on a per acre basis, which is how that program works, to spread silicate rock, is that also a demand driver for carbon removal? Because we expect in many scenarios, though not all, that dissolution of rock, that pH buffering effect will also remove carbon from the atmosphere. So that's the policy piece is, could we pay people for soil pH management? It's not as much money as a carbon credit, but it's still doing the activity. The next piece of that is like, how would we actually know if it was carbon removal? If you weren't doing all of the stuff that we do for enhanced weathering, and as you know, enhanced weathering companies are doing a lot of work to establish in the field that they're actually removing carbon. And so this goes back to Circe's kind of second or third bucket of work where there isn't guidance for how you would do that. And we're working with academic groups to develop guidance on how you would measure this kind of enhanced weathering at the watershed scale. So as you know, the idea is that the rocks dissolve, the carbonates run off into waterways. Could you check in waterways if you're actually removing carbon at any meaningful scale? And then in the really long run, 2070, 2100, could you integrate that into large scale sort of national greenhouse gas inventories and global carbon budgets?
Thank you. Danny, you had a point or a question?
Maybe just a quick comment just to say I really appreciate Anu's presentation and also just to call out, I think looking for constructive opportunities where there's a question that needs to be answered, where people have common problems. My criticism is that the standard offsetting model doesn't actually help us solve that. But I think, Anu, you've identified several where there's an opportunity to do something better and different. That's exactly the sort of thing that I think will be really helpful to addressing these problems. And I just wanted to call that out as a really positive thing. Thank you.
I have, we have some audience questions, but I think it might be useful to address just one of them, and then we'll keep the rest for the dedicated 30-minute slot we have in the end. So one question that we have from the audience, and Anu, you can feel free to start this answer, is what brings more credibility and consistency to MRV efforts? Is it federal policy or is it regulation? You're on mute.
That's a great question, and I think Eli and Danny would also have a lot to say on this from the policy and the industry perspective. I think, our theory of change as an organization is really about building that consistency from the bottom up. So making sure that the little pieces are the same. So for example, in energy accounting for direct air capture methodologies, they often reference essentially like the types of data you can use for your grid emission factors. And so can we get everyone to agree on which ones are good to use in the US, for example, and actually in compliance grade protocols and other jurisdictions, would include California in that's sort of built into what makes something a compliance grade protocol. I think one thing that I've learned through the process of essentially combing through all of the standards that currently exist is that they often reference certain trusted authorities. So for example, a lot of things point back to the Clean Development Mechanism and the Kyoto Protocol, and for basic things like mass balances. And so I think there's a lot of value in identifying, kind of who are these neutral, respected technical arbiters, and making sure that those groups have the evidence base they need to develop CDR methodologies. And we're thinking about this a lot in the context of the IPCC is actually doing a CDR methodology report in the next couple of years. And so thinking about what evidence exists, what data sets are really going to make it easy for that group that has all of these great processes and governance in place to do that work well.
That answers several other questions as well. Thanks for that perspective. I guess it's time for our next speaker, and that's Eli Kane. I would like to invite, oh yeah, you are already on camera. I can see you, so great. Eli is a senior policy manager at Carbon Removal Alliance. It's a nonprofit group consisting of members from the voluntary carbon market, both buyers and sellers, and they are working together to set quality standards for the VCM. While at the NREL, or the National Renewable Energy Laboratory previously, Eli designed and implemented programs to procure carbon removal, including the landmark Department of Energy Carbon Removal Pilot Procurement Prize under the previous administration. So he'll have a lot of perspective. Eli, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Mark, whenever you're able to share the slides. Perfect. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. My name is Eli Kane. I'm the Senior Policy Manager at the Carbon Removal Alliance. I have a slightly different perspective on MRV than the previous panelists, so I'm excited to walk you through that. I'm going to start with a quick overview on who the Carbon Removal Alliance is, how we think about MRV policy, and then end with some policy recommendations for MRV. So to start, as Deepika mentioned, CRA is a nonprofit coalition of carbon removal suppliers and buyers. We seek to advance the durable carbon removal field primarily through federal policy. My job, leading the policy development function, is to translate the needs of member organizations into effective federal policy. MRV is a critical component of that, as I'll get to. But CRA also has a communications team that works with our member organizations to ensure that we're effectively communicating with policymakers, and an advocacy team that works to ensure our policies get passed and implemented. We can go to the next slide. So our mission at a high level is building a gigaton scale carbon removal industry that is unequivocally good for the climate, economy, and people. Again, MRV very tied in with that. Next slide. And our membership criteria and our policy priorities are really guided by our key organizational principles for high quality carbon removal. So our membership is exclusively composed of durable CDR suppliers and buyers that have committed to these same sourcing principles. I also want to highlight that robust MRV is only one component of high quality carbon removal. It is equally important to ensure that carbon removal has its desired environmental impacts and is done in a way that centers environmental justice. Next slide. So quick overview of our membership. We have about 27 different member companies. You'll recognize many of the names. Collectively, these companies are responsible for nearly all durable carbon removal to date. So they are exciting companies who are doing these projects right now in the United States, which is a really exciting thing to have. Next slide. Okay, at a high level, quickly walking through our CRA's policy priorities for this year. Main organizational priority is market creation. In other words, what policies are needed to create a market capable of supporting 10 gigatons per year of carbon removal? Obviously, we are nowhere near that to date. And so what policies do we need to implement now to ensure we get to that end date? Some of these policy priorities include tax credits for CDR, including the CDR Investment Act that was introduced in the last session, policies that leverage industrial integrations of CDR as a source of demand, and policies that create the necessary market infrastructure that will need to reach that scale. Next slide. A key component of that market infrastructure is MRV policy. So in our view, MRV policy is demand policy. It is part of that critical market infrastructure that we need to support the industry. Next slide. Because from a market perspective, fundamentally, MRV ensures that buyers of carbon removal get what they pay for. The examples I always like to give are, if you were trying to buy a stock in a company and they said, we are 80% sure that this stock is real, would you buy that stock? Definitely not, right? Or if you were buying a painting and the seller told you, we're pretty confident that this painting is not a fake, you wouldn't buy it. Every other mature market has guardrails in place to ensure that buyers get what they pay for. Carbon removal needs the same thing. Carbon removal needs rigorous MRV to ensure that. Without rigorous MRV, we won't attract the next generation of buyers and we won't meet our climate goals. Next slide. So it is really critical that MRV underpins both all purchases of carbon removal and is a key part of carbon removal policy. But as the other panelists already articulated very well, there are many challenges to doing that. Most of these have already been touched on. A few I'll quickly mention are a lack of authoritative standards, a lack of investment, and high costs associated with MRV. Go to the next slide. But truly, it is because of the challenges I just mentioned and that Danny and Anu mentioned that the governments can play such a large role in developing the MRV infrastructure that we need. So, for example, we started this webinar with a terminology quiz, but really there is still significant disagreement on basic definitions and nomenclature in our space. So how can we ensure that we're comparing apples to apples if we can't even agree on what an apple is? Or to really, really torture the metaphor, how to measure that apple. So there are many government initiatives that are already working to address these issues, like the NIST CDR consortium Anu mentioned, and DOE has released great literature, including a biomass carbon removal and storage life cycle assessment best practices report recently, but there is a lot more work that the government can do to help level up MRV. Next slide. In the fall, we published a report describing 12 recommendations for government action on CDR. This year, it is our main priority to translate that report into actionable federal policy. I'm going to describe a few of the recommendations right now, but there's also a link to the full report in the chat, and feel free to reach out if you want to go into the details. Okay, next slide. So the first one is the federal government should continue and expand the work it's doing through the national labs related to MRV. As Deepika mentioned, I come from a national lab. I'm a huge proponent of them. Collectively, they employ close to 50,000 of our leading scientists in the United States. And I've been involved in the projects that they're doing related to MRV. They are incredibly catalytic, but to date, they haven't focused on every CDR pathway. So our first recommendation is expanding those programs and continuing to issue best practice guidelines like the Bikers LCA best practice report. Next slide. When I worked with DOE, we used to frequently say that our vision for the CDR market was industry-led but government-supported, and that is true for MRV as well. We believe the government should validate existing third-party MRV protocols by leveraging them in existing government programs and by funding national labs to help refine and develop those protocols. They're not perfect. They're a step in the right direction, but existing third-party protocols do need help, and the national labs can be a great technical assistance source for those protocols. In terms of integrating MRV into existing government programs, the CDR Purchase Pilot Prize that we mentioned at the beginning is a great opportunity to do this. We go to the next slide. The Purchase Pilot Prize was launched in 2013. It's the first initiative ever for a federal government to purchase durable carbon removal credits directly from the private sector. It is also the first US federal program ever to require third-party MRV. It's a really great opportunity for the DOE to bring in third-party protocols, validate them, and say what is best practice for procurement in the space. Assuming the program continues, the end result will be an approved list of both protocols and verification bodies and an audit of financial arrangements between suppliers and MRV implementation partners. That list will be by pathway, so certain protocols will be approved, certain registries will be approved for certain protocols, and it will be a really wonderful opportunity to have the government set both an implicit standard for what good procurement looks like. Next slide. And the last recommendation I'll touch on here, and again, there are about 8 or 9 more in the report, is that we do need more fundamental research into open scientific questions. But not only do we need more research into the open questions, we need more repetitions. The only way that we really learn is by doing in this space. And so implementing MRV requirements into existing programs like the Purchase Pilot Prize, the Carbon Negative Shop pilots, all of those will allow us to get the repetitions we need to learn what works, what doesn't work, and where the open questions are. So doing that, learning by doing, will let the field grow our collective understanding of MRV. Okay, next slide. I know that the past few weeks, months have been more discouraging at the federal policy level, but we still firmly believe there's a path forward for CDR policy and more specifically MRV policy at the federal level. There are several reasons I could get into for why that is, but to leave you with 2. One is that if we want to integrate CDR into true bipartisan, non-environmental policies like a carbon border adjustment mechanism or other trade policies, we will need robust MRV to prevent fraud and unwanted behavior in those programs. The second is that fundamental research, which includes many of the recommendations I outlined earlier, is still strongly bipartisan. National labs are incredibly popular under Republican administrations, and we've already gotten strong indications that appropriations requests for national labs dedicated to MRV are a popular thing to do. That's the note I want to leave you on. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Eli. That was great. Just a clarification question. I think that some of this question will touch upon some of the audience questions that we're seeing as well. You talked about the government potentially playing the role of like validating MRV and things like that. Just the data that underlies all of this. Where is this data coming from? Is it self-reported? How can we know whether all of that is real? So yeah, a bunch of questions in the audience touched on this aspect.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I welcome the other panelists' perspective on it too. We say MRV like it's one thing, but first to articulate, there's at least 4 different components of this, right? You have measuring, monitoring, reporting, and verification. So you have many different steps in that chain, and each of those might have multiple actors operating to do similar functions. So in terms of where data is collected, sometimes it depends on the pathway in terms of if it's in-field sensors or sensors on the DAC facility, or if it is a sample that's sent off to a private lab to test, and then that testing result is sent back to a verification body who sends it back to a protocol to do the verification. It's a complicated process, and it's an onion that as you start peeling back, you realize how many actors are involved. I will say there is strong precedent for third-party protocol development and oversight in that way. So I'm not saying those protocols are perfect, but they are a strong step in the right direction to make sure the science is real and that when we're saying a net ton has been removed, a net ton actually has been removed.
Thanks, Eli. At this time, it might be a good idea to open up the entire panel for a dedicated audience Q&A. And if Anu and Danny would please come on camera. Did either of you want to say anything about that previous question about data verification or the self-reporting or anything like that? Or we can just jump into the other questions we've got.
Maybe just very briefly, I think, as Eli said, when you start peeling the layers of the onion, you see how much is going on. And I'll just observe that we often substitute procedural answers for substantive answers. So this trusted party looked into this tough question, and you can trust them because they're a trusted party. That is sometimes a perfectly valid approach. And at other times, in some respects, it kind of kicks the can to, well, do you really trust that that person did a good job? And I think we'll have differences of opinion about when that works and when that doesn't. But I just wanted to call that out because at the end of the day, a lot of this is about trust. And I think there are some lessons historically about, where that has and hasn't worked. And I'm really excited and hopeful that we can do a better job here. Just eyes open.
Thanks, Danny. All right, I'm trying to find the first question that we will address from the audience. Interestingly, I was at a conference recently, and I overheard somebody that represented a registry saying anyone can start a registry. Can you all throw some light on that of like what is a registry and like what are the registries doing? What are the CDR registries out there and what their role is and how they fit into the whole ecosystem? And also, is it true? Can anyone start a registry? It was odd.
I'll just hold this one up. This is a screenshot of a carbon credit that John Oliver issued when he did a segment on carbon offsets. It's a joke, but in some respects, John Oliver's production company was a registry. They did a lot of the things. It's all fake, obviously, and it's all satire, but you can just say, here's the thing, right? And that's obviously an absurd exaggeration, which maybe highlights these tensions. But yes, anyone can stand up and say, here's my standard, here's my methodology. And there's a big difference between people who do that well and people who do that poorly. It is hard to describe the difference other than do you trust them? And that's where I keep coming back to. So I'm not saying that to cast aspersions on the people who are doing this well, but anyone can stand up and do it.
Are there registries today doing CDR and like what about them gives us, I guess, confidence? Maybe that's a question that follows up from that point. And Anu and Eli, feel free to jump in as well.
So I think, oh, Eli, go ahead.
You go first, I'll go after you.
Okay. I think there's a number of things that folks are doing to help build trust in the ecosystem. One that I was somewhat pleasantly surprised by is the availability and visibility and licensing of the standard itself. Keeping in mind that often for registries, standards development is a big part of their business model. Like it costs money to hire scientists, to write this stuff, and to go through this process. And what I'm seeing often as a way of building trust in the industry as a whole is transparency around what is in the standard and the process around developing the standard and change logs and investments in the science and communicating how the standard itself was developed. It's a business, so there's a customer education component to that as well. And so I want to own that. But I think a lot of what I have seen so far is around transparency. Like this is what we say we're measuring. That said, it is hard for folks who are not deep in the weeds of these things to read a standard, even if it is fully available on a website and know kind of the trade-offs that are being made.
Yeah, I agree. And I would maybe just take even one step further back, which is to say the industry is coalesced around 4 or 5 different standards bodies right now. And I do think there is a need for like a meta quantification standard to say how are we evaluating one standard against another standard. So that is a gap that I know Anna agrees with me on that. But when standards are building their protocols, they do it in a really collaborative and science-led fashion, right? This isn't something that happens behind closed doors. It's done with public consultation, leveraging the expertise that's in the field, with multiple rounds of iterations and evolutions, and they change over time as the science evolves. So I do want to demystify that a little bit. Like these are things that we all have access to see with experts who have devoted their lives to building out the science there. And most importantly, as the science evolves, the standards can be updated and reflect the state of the field.
Let me maybe add very briefly, because I'm not trying to suggest that there aren't good people and there aren't good activities here. And I should also disclose, I consulted previously for a carbon dioxide removal registry. So I'm not going to name names here as to who I think is better or worse, but I do want to name this dynamic, which I think is something hopefully both Eli and Anu would agree with. Let me take it into the non-carbon removal space. In the carbon crediting registries that aren't focused on carbon removal, we have this kind of whack-a-mole race to the bottom problem. And there is a well-known registry that was recently stood up that is understood in the broader carbon crediting industry. If a company develops a protocol, and by the way, many of these protocols are developed by the companies who seek to use them. So some registries say we do it in-house, we do it with our team of scientists. We have this kind of, best in class approach, which is the flavor I would describe Eli as articulating. And I think there's a lot to recommend that. Others say financially interested market participants can write and submit their own protocols for consideration and will approve them potentially. And there is a registry that is well known in the industry. If you take it to one of the larger incumbent registries and they say no, you can immediately go to this registry and they'll say yes, and everybody knows that. So that's an example of like forum shopping, watered down, frankly, corrupt bullshit that I hope won't emerge in this industry, but is showing signs of emerging, not from, I think the perspectives of people represented by Anu or Eli today, but those are those same pernicious, toxic, competitive forces that make it hard for the honest players to do a good job. And I keep repeating this, not to denigrate the very thoughtful efforts of the good players, but to recognize if this is a commodity for an invisible, unverifiable, counterfactual claim, and we allow cheaters, the cheaters are going to win. And so that's a dynamic that those who are doing a really good high road job need to keep front of mind and keep talking about, because the natural political forces in these markets will drag down quality in the absence of that affirmative discussion.
And maybe I would just quickly add, that's why I'm so bullish on the role of governments in this space, is providing that high level validation and approval for certain things. Because like you said, like that's the role of regulation, is to prevent bad actors like that. And so government regulation is an area where we can bring that in, clean up the space, and make sure that we're all playing by the same standards and rules.
I think one thing that I would add to the government regulation piece, totally agree. It does seem like one way or the other, government will be a backstop for quality, ideally for really high quality. And that's, I think, what we're all pushing for. One thing that I've noticed is jurisdictions will still write their own rules to a certain extent for various reasons. They will need to have, this is my version, our people did this. And so that's a little bit why our theory of change sort of keeps falling back to, let's do this from the bottom up. So if jurisdictions are writing variations of their own standards, this is true both on the regulatory side and on the nonprofit standards bodies for different industries that operate in different jurisdictions. There are these existing local ecosystems. What we want to make sure happens is that they are backed by the same evidence base. So if you are thinking about the tests for weathering that are commonly used in the mining industry and are standardized in Australia and Canada, we want that to be backed by the same evidence base. You're doing the same types of tests. And I think that in the long run is going to give us a lot more confidence that we are actually doing what we say we're doing.
That was really rich discussion. Some questions coming in on the audience Q&A box. I know some of you are trying to answer them online, but a live discussion might even add more color to it. So I'll try to read some of the ones that are not yet answered. How do tools for MRV interact with standard development? I know that we've touched on this, but if there's like a short response to that you might have.
Yeah, I think I said this, so it's just iterative. So if you don't have a way of measuring carbonates in water, you can't write a standard that tells you to measure carbonates in water. And if someone builds that tool, you can build it into your standard. You can collect that data. You can use that data for a model. It's all kind of in the mix together.
A follow-up on the iterative nature of what you just said. So does that mean that as we learn more, your credits and how you accounted for them will have to also be updated? Will that also be iterative then? Or should that be iterative then?
So the historical answer to that question is nobody ever retroactively changes anything, nor do they do anything to account for when we understand there's been widespread fraud or serious problems, which again, I'm not alleging have happened yet in this industry, but have definitely happened in other applications. There is no retrospective. So what happens in the conventional industry is that if we change our understanding of how to do the accounting, we never apply that retroactively. We set a sort of sunset date and we say going forward, we now treat it this way. But for market stability purposes, we never do anything about the legacy stuff. And I appreciate the market stability consideration. On the other hand, if you have registries that are marketing those credits as representing good and true climate benefits when they know for a fact they're not, that looks like fraud. And in fact, that is fraud. And that is basically how the market operates today. It's a real pickle. And it's why this focus on precise accounting of climate outcomes rather than the accounting of good faith innovation and deployment and interventions on the road to fully standardized approaches to this stuff, which we do not yet have. There's a big difference between those two. And it's why I keep hitting on these differences, because I would also reflect very briefly on Anu's last answer, this iterative nature of development. People are writing standards where we don't have the methodological tools. So they're also creating precedents that right now we know don't work and maybe the best we can do today and will certainly be better in 5 years. But we also risk creating very low quality standards that don't get updated, precisely because updating would cause you to say, wow, actually the interventions I'm making produce fewer climate benefits than I used to claim. And I'd prefer to defer that day of reckoning as long as possible. It's really difficult to do this right when you have financially interested market participants structuring these questions. And the more you can bring in, and we can debate who and how, people who don't have a financial stake in answering the question, what's the right way to measure this stuff? That's going to be really important. And I think the more we can move away from these hyper precisely quantified claims, the more accurate and true and meaningful and durable our claims and commitments can be. Appreciating in the long run, we all need to be able to say exactly as Eli said, what did you buy? What did you get? What did it do for us? I don't think we're quite there in some of the areas where I'm most excited about the potential for deployment and innovation.
Just on a similar note, another question from an audience member is asking whether the emergence of an international carbon trading scheme, will it have an impact on the voluntary carbon market? How might they interact under the Article 6.4?
So I'm on the Article 6.4 methodological expert panel, which is charged with trying to write these rules. There's not a lot I can say publicly about the internal deliberations of that body, but I will suggest here that we've had a conversation that's focused a lot on durable carbon removal outcomes. Durability is a very politically contentious concept because there are interventions where we only have confidence on the order of a couple of decades. And there are interventions where we have confidence on the scale of centuries to millennia and sometimes longer. And both of those interests are represented in the political process and the negotiations. And so there's not a lot to point to publicly, in part because there are deep divisions about the approaches to take on these issues. So if you think that an international consensus-based negotiating process is going to work with the US having pulled out and started a process of delegitimizing the Paris Agreement, if you think that is going to answer all of these questions, please tell me what I should be doing at my next meeting, because it is very, very difficult. It is very, very difficult.
Right. We have some more questions that we should get to. Some are really specific, and I'm trying to see if we can get more broader questions answered first, and then get into the specific ones. Which governments are best positioned to set standards for MRV? Or I guess to rephrase that in a little bit broader way, which are the governments that are sort of leading the work in this area, and if you can share a little bit on who's involved and what they're doing.
I can start us off. I think that there are a few different places where there's active standards development, and it's usually tied to a broader climate policy targets, similar to the California example. Probably the one that folks talk about the most right now in the MRV CDR space is the EU carbon removal and carbon farming certification program. So they are developing, so they have their 3 categories. They have their durable removals, I think products, and then carbon farming. They're developing methodologies. There are, in the durable category, I believe, already BECS and DAX methodologies that are available, and they will be looking at biochar, and then a little further down the road, enhanced weathering. And so they're convening expert groups around this, and they have a specific consultant that does more of the drafting pieces of it. I would say that process is the furthest along, but it has a caveat in that it's not specific to a policy use case yet. There's an expectation that it will be used for something like the EU emissions trading scheme, but that's not, as far as I'm aware, if folks jump in if I'm missing something, it's not super specifically tied to a policy use case yet. And so I think that's something that we always want to keep in mind is, as I've said, standards and MRV really are specific to your policy use case. And so it's hard to design really robust, rigorous standards absent a sense of like where it will be used and who needs it for what. But right now, probably the furthest ahead in developing protocols for carbon removal would be the EU.
Yeah, that's definitely Canada released one for DAC very recently. Maybe the only thing I'd say is the Canadian approach and certainly the EU approach are very almost diametrically opposed to the path that US DOE has historically taken on this, as I alluded to in my presentation, where we really intended to be industry-led, government-supported. EU is intending to write their own protocols. And I think there's a big difference between governments writing the protocols and the governments writing meta quantification standards that hold protocols accountable. In the US, we've attempted to, or at least set up the foundation for saying which protocols meet our definitions of quality, not writing protocols ourselves. There's no initiative currently within the US federal government to write our own protocols for many reasons, one of which is the time it takes. If you look at how long the EU has spent writing their protocols, they've done 2 and 3 years. They have many more to come, which will take us well through 2027. And so it's just a lot longer of a process to do, which just delays all of the subsequent policies that you want to tie to that protocol. Whereas in the US, if we can set quantification standards and say quality standards for certain protocols that third parties and the private sector develops, it's a lot faster to do. And hopefully we end up with the same outcome, which is verified protocols that meet definitions of quality.
One other thing that I would just add into here, since we were talking about Article 6, the countries that are best placed to do CDR policy right now, sort of high capacity, have a lot of regulatory architecture, EU, US, the US's enormous technical capacity in the government, DOE, and the national labs. Amazing, super important for innovation, not necessarily the countries with the largest CDR potential in the long run. And so there is a piece of work here in how we translate all of the really incredible stuff we're doing in essentially the EU, Canada, US, a couple other countries, to places that have the highest CDR potential, and having realistic assessments of how much of the quantification science really makes sense in that capacity. And I think thinking about this in the context of the IPCC inventories and the sort of tiers there can be helpful, right? We want to think about how we unlock CDR potential in a way that is actually feasible for the place that CDR potential exists.
Let me just to add just to add another layer into this, I think we are talking about the role of governments as a solution to the problem of low quality standards or political representation of the private sector. I think it's really important to talk about regulatory capture, because this is also, I think, widely documented in this space. I'll offer a couple examples. California runs a large forest carbon offsets program as part of its cap and trade program. That those protocols were written in the private sector and essentially rubber stamped into the process. I'm somebody who thinks that's not gone well. You might have a different point of view, but there's no question that that was a situation where the government literally let private industry write its own rules and imported that in. And those rules haven't been updated in almost 10 years, despite now just as many peer-reviewed studies showing really widespread problems in that program. I'd also call out, I'm mostly concerned with the experience that federal government scientists and researchers are having under the current administration, which is unlike anything we've ever seen before. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out that Lawrence Livermore National Lab took money from a Detroit Utilities executive's 501c4 campaign, a Detroit utility called DTE, which owns a number of biomass facilities in the Central Valley. And they produce material, including educational material, i.e. propaganda for schools about the safety of those plants and projects. The idea that government is a completely neutral actor when we have examples of specific industry influence and specific regulatory capture dynamics that are present in some of these markets, I think we need to be more careful about that. And again, I fully embrace more role for government and more role for research scientists being involved in these processes. But it is not necessarily the case that the government was there and therefore it was better. Sometimes the government is there to defer to an industry consensus. And a lot of times those consensus points don't make any sense. Another example, which we have in California, is our accounting technique for our low carbon fuel standard for direct air capture projects simply doesn't look at produced oil and gas emissions. So you can, and indeed, there's very likely there will be facilities built in Texas that get credit for direct air capture that are also producing oil and gas with the injected CO2. And those emissions are not included in California's accounting protocols because the national lab consultants who wrote that simply didn't put it in the system boundary. Oops.
I don't think anyone who sees the current federal landscape today thinks the federal government is a neutral third party. Like that's certainly not the impression, but done right, it does have a huge role. And I think that's where like people like you and me and all the other industry players that come into this have the ability to help guide this direction. Because if you leave it up to their own, like they don't have a lot of the internal expertise and understanding and everything that you bring to the table. But B, we can't do it without them. So it's like we don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face simply because like it could go wrong. We need to lean in and say, here's how to do it right.
We are very much agreed, and I want you to hear agreement and positivity there. But I bring up these negative stories because I think to succeed, we need to say we have taken a path that is aware of those problems and we've done something better. So in no way am I trying to suggest either that there's like a government office that's ready to do this on their own. You're totally right. Nobody's ready to pull those levers, nor would it be wise to not include the private sector in those standard setting processes. But I get really nervous when I watch, when I say industry people, I don't mean you, Eli, but I watch individual actors manipulate these processes, and I don't see people like Anu holding the pen. That's an outcome that worries me. I think there is a constructive and collaborative process that improves these outcomes for sure.
I would let Anu do all of this. If it was up to me, she'd be responsible for everything in CDR. So
I
Thanks,
think
guys.
we have time for one last question before we wrap up our wonderful, rich discussion here. I think that there's two questions that I find are kind of unanswered, but it might not be a 3-minute answer, but we'll try. One of the questions that I'm seeing is about like, okay, so what can communities access today when it comes to like, all of these problems exist, projects might still go on the ground. What then must the communities be looking for? What can they access? About the metrics of accountability and quality and such. That's one. The other question was broader, kind of related, which was about just with all these different policy use cases that I know you mentioned. I think just the purpose of MRV. How can then there be common metrics for CDR efficacy? So I think they're sort of related, but I know it's very little time to answer these questions, but I'll offer you very smart people a chance to do that.
That's
Well,
a
I
massive
think I'll put one of
question.
them on the spot.
This is going to be a non-answer, but in terms of the community question, I have this question for communities that are thinking about hosting projects is, what do you want to see? What do you need? And can we build that more reliably into the process? And I think about particularly around data sharing and data legibility. We've done some work in mapping all of the public and semi-private data sources that are feeding into carbon removal accounting, particularly open systems accounting right now. And what jumps out to me is, if you are a technical expert who is trained in a national lab, this is great. You can go in and you can like pull out the data. And so the question that I would toss back, and please do reach out to me via email if you have thoughts on this, is what question do you want answered in order to support a project in your community, and what can we technical folks who think about MRV do to make that data legible and accessible?
Well, thank you so much. You did it. You did answer within the time, and I think that that's a good time to wrap this up. I want to take a moment to thank all of you. Danny, Anu, Eli, thank you so much for being here, answering all of these questions, and for this rich debate and discussion that we were able to experience with you. So thanks for the shared learning opportunity. And thanks everybody for attending. This webinar will be recorded and placed on the website of Climate Center.